everyone. Well, we made it. We are in part 5 of a 5-part series on the parable of the Good Samaritan. I hope this has been a rich and meaningful series to you, not just learning more about the context of the story, but that you've been able to more faithfully walk after Jesus as a result of this incredible story that maybe most of us didn't know to the depth that we now know it. But it's not just about knowing things better, it's about walking it out. And so this last episode, there is one more piece to this puzzle that we have been putting together about what it means to become the neighbor that Jesus desires us to be. And in the last episode, we talked about love your enemies and about how Jesus bringing a Samaritan into the story would have just outraged his audience, that many of them would have left, others who stuck around and would have been like, how are we supposed to live this out? There is one more piece to the parable that if we understand what I believe Jesus was drawing upon, it's going to better help us to understand how we can love all people, especially those that we would classify as enemies. And at the end of the last episode, I said, listen, loving your enemies, it's possible. It's possible because it happened before. And what I was referring to is a story from 2 Chronicles 28. And in 2 Chronicles 28, there is this amazing story. Now, I know maybe for some of you, you're thinking, hey, I haven't been in 2 Chronicles in a long time. Maybe for others of you, you're like, I didn't even know there was a 2 Chronicles. But let me give you the context of 2 Chronicles 28. So when Solomon ends his reign, he dies in 931 BC. If you watched the last episode, you'll recall that the kingdom divides, that you have a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. Now, at times, these two are allies of one another. At other times, they're not necessarily allies, but they're cordial with one another. And at other times, they are at odds with one another. In our story that we're going to look at today, they are at odds. They are enemies of one another. And the king in the north of Israel is called Pekah. The king in the south is a guy by the name of Ahaz. And just to recall that in the 9th century, Samaria becomes the capital of Israel. Jerusalem is the capital of Judah. And as a result of the behavior of the king of Judah stationed in Jerusalem, a guy by the name of Ahaz, God is allowing two different groups to, in a sense, execute judgment on what Judah is doing. And Ahaz has sacrificed his own children in the fire. He's burned them alive to appease a God he felt like he needed to appease, clearly not the God of Israel. And the people are living into idolatry, and there's all of this injustice happening. And so God allows the king of Aram, which is in present-day Syria, it's their capital city in the ancient world was Damascus, and they come and they just hammer Judah. And then on the heels of them, Israel does the same thing, but it gets way out of control. Israel comes and fights against Judah, and we read in 2 Chronicles 28 that 120,000 people of Judah are killed, and then another 200,000 are taken as prisoners back to Samaria. And so I want to pick up the story here in 2 Chronicles 28. If you're following along with your Bible, you can read along with me. I'm not going to put this up on the screen. I'm going to put one verse up, the last verse on the screen. And clearly, for those of you who are listening to the podcast version and you're driving to work, just keep the car on the road. I will read this to you. So they come to Samaria, and in verse 9 it says, "But a prophet of the Lord named Oded was there, and he went out to meet the army when it returned to Samaria. He said to them, 'Because the Lord, the God of your ancestors, was angry with Judah, he gave them into your hand. But you have slaughtered them in a rage that reaches to heaven. And now you intend to make the men and women of Judah and Jerusalem your slaves? But aren't you also guilty of sins against the Lord your God? Now listen to me. Send back your fellow Israelites you have taken as prisoners, for the Lord's fierce anger rests on you. And then it says, so the soldiers in verse 14 gave up the prisoners and plunder in the presence of the officials and all the assembly. And then in verse 15, this is what I want to show you. Check out the details of this verse. The men designated by name took the prisoners, and from the plunder they clothed all who were naked. They provided them with clothes and sandals, food and drink, and healing balm. All those who are weak they put on donkeys. So they took them back to their fellow Israelites at Jericho, the city of palms, and returned to Samaria. Are you seeing the connections here? Friends, when we get the story of the Good Samaritan, we have the same details here in 2 Chronicles 28. The man on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was stripped naked. The Samaritan clothed him. Here they're being clothed. The Samaritan helped the man by putting oil and wine, and it was a way of serving as healing balm. It happens here in 2 Chronicles 28. The Good Samaritan puts the man on his own donkey. They're put on donkeys here. The Good Samaritan takes him on a donkey to Jericho, and they're taken to Jericho, and the people respond, and then they return back to Samaria, which will later be known as the area of the Samaritans. Friends, the parable of the Good Samaritan has happened before. And as Jesus is telling this story, for those who have acute ears and know the scriptures, they'll be going, wait a minute, I know these details. No, you don't think he is. He's drawing our attention back to 2 Chronicles 28. And what happens in 2 Chronicles 28? One of the most astounding stories of war history where enemies are actually loving their enemies. This is an amazing story in the history of the people of Israel and Judah. And I believe Jesus is drawing his audience's attention to this story. Because there's something that is going on in this story that we find a connection in Leviticus 19:18. Now, why would we go to Leviticus 19:18? Well, if you remember in Luke 10, the whole thing gets underway with the expert in the Torah asking Jesus, hey, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus goes, well, what is written in the Torah? How do you read it? And he says, well, I think you need to love God and love neighbor. Deuteronomy 6:5 is love God. Love neighbor is Leviticus 19:18. And as Jesus has done elsewhere in Matthew 22, he says to love God is to love neighbor. And all of the Torah and the prophets hang on these two commandments. And so when we look at this passage of loving your neighbor from Leviticus 19:18, it says, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That is how we have traditionally translated it. Now, if we look at this in more detail, the way that you could imply what this translation is saying is that you have to love yourself well before you can love someone else well. And to some extent, that is true. If you have a messed up understanding of love and for yourself there is just this self-loathing and self-hatred, well, then you're going to struggle to love someone else well because you don't even understand what love is for yourself. But to just keep it at a place where you go, well, until I have learned to love myself well, I can't love someone else well, I think we are missing what is going on in this passage. Because that is how we would look at it if we are looking at it as a 21st century Western American who thinks very individualistically minded. It's me first. But in the context of Leviticus 19, the chapter, and specifically this verse 18, there is actually another way that you can translate this verse and do it in a faithful way to the original Hebrew. That rather than saying, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you can equally translate it, and you shall love your neighbor who is like yourself. Now, what's the distinction going on here? Well, oftentimes what happens is that when we're trying to love our neighbor, and Jesus has made that very clear, that includes our enemy, we look at somebody else and we see everything about that person that is unlike us. Where they live, how they vote, how they think. We see all of the differences long before we ever look for any commonalities. And yet in this rendition, to love your neighbor who is like yourself, it carries this idea that if you're going to love your enemy, to love your neighbor, to love someone that you struggle to love, then one of the most significant things you can do to move in that direction is not to first and foremost highlight all of the things that make you different. It's to try to highlight all the things that you share in common, that you find the common humanity in someone else. And so you go, well, how do you do that? Well, let's just start with the basic. It doesn't matter who they are, like you and like me. They are in desperate need of God's grace and mercy and love and forgiveness on a daily basis. Can we begin there? Because if we can begin there and we can recognize that someone else is in desperate need of that, we are already finding the common humanity. And the reason why I believe that Jesus tells the parable of the Good Samaritan to expound on Leviticus 19:18 is that I believe that this is what Jesus is after when he says, and to love your neighbor who is like yourself. Because when you go back to 2 Chronicles 28, and if you were to reread those first 15 verses very carefully, you will see these are your fellow Israelites. Oded says, what are you doing? Take your fellow Israelites. He's reminding them of their common humanity. He is reminding them of their common heritage. And friends, at the end of the day, we are all people. And we are all desperate in need of God's love and mercy and grace and forgiveness. And we've got to extend that to other people as well. We've got to find the common humanity. And I believe that when you put these stories together, that this is about loving our neighbors and our enemies and realizing that they are our brothers and our sisters. And if we can begin there, if we can begin with finding a common humanity, then friends, I believe that we'll be able to walk out this commandment Jesus gives of loving all people well, regardless of where they fall on the spectrum of humanity. We will find the common humanity and we'll start from there. And that is a much more hopeful place to be than highlighting everything we don't agree with, we don't like, we don't even care about with respect to somebody else. Now, I've been thinking about this a lot. I'm a little bit amped up. I was amped up in the last episode, and I just feel like that this story Jesus tells is the most explosive story that he ever told that talks about the idea of loving and sacrificing for other people. And then, of course, he goes and lives that by going to the cross to die for all of humanity. And as I've been thinking more and more about this, I've been thinking a lot about just my own engagement with my own children. And just thinking about kids in general. You know, kids are masters at finding the common humanity. You know, when you get kids at a young age, and you put a bunch of kids, outside together or on the playground or in a room, they don't look at each other and go, he's black. She's Asian. He's poor. She's dumb. They look at them and they look at one another and they go, well, I'm a kid and they're a kid. We should play. And at a very young age, kids do not see black and white, Latino, Asian. They don't see rich or poor. They don't see Republican, Democrat, Independent. They don't look for any of those. They don't see anything. They just say, you're a kid and I'm a kid. And you can take someone to Africa and they'll respond the same way. You take someone to Asia and they're going to respond the same way. You take someone to Europe, they're going to respond the same way at that age. But the problem is we grow up. And we begin to learn to look at the differences in other people long before we affirm the commonalities with them. And I believe that if we can become more like children, that we can actually find the common humanity. And we can begin to love people more and more the way Jesus is asking us to love them. It starts off with a question. And who is my neighbor? And Jesus goes, I'm going to tell you a story because we need to reframe this. This is not about who is my neighbor. It's about, well, who was a neighbor? And as we've been saying over the last several episodes, this parable is not about identifying who is a neighbor. It's about whether or not we are a neighbor. And that in becoming a neighbor, the way Jesus wants us to be, we have to shift the focus. We have to begin from a place of not what are the implications for me and what are other people going to think about me if I'm loving and serving these kinds of people, or what's going to happen to me if I actually help this person in their time of need and it's a very precarious situation. It's what's going to happen to them if I don't step in, if I don't lend a hand, if I don't help them, if I don't stand by them and affirm their dignity and who they are. What's going to happen to them? Secondly, we've talked about that you've got to empathize, not to just look at them from a distance, but to go, I need to walk in their shoes. I need to empathize with their situation. I need to understand what they are going through and what their world is like. But I can't just stand in their shoes. I've got to respond that there's empathy and there's got to be action. And then as we talked in the last episode, if we're really going to love our enemy, then we have to imagine the good. We have to imagine it is possible that those we deem as enemies and everybody in between has the capacity to do good, the capacity to be good. That we can imagine a different world and a different way of responding to people who are different than us, that we don't agree with. And that if we can shift the focus and empathize and respond in action to imagine the good and then to find the common humanity, to recognize that I can imagine this because I am finding the common good, then friends, I believe that what Jesus says to the expert at the end, go and do likewise, is something we will be willing and able to do in the power of the Holy Spirit to be who Jesus is asking us to be. And so, friends, there you go. The parable of the Good Samaritan in all of its layers and all of its nuances and all of its punch. And my hope is, again, that we don't just leave this series with a better understanding, but that we leave this series walking more closely on the heels of Jesus Christ. And so in order to continue to help us to do that, there are going to be additional questions at walkingthetext.com. There are recommended resources to go deeper with these parables. And next week, we're going to launch into a new parable, which I'm really excited to do. But for now, as we take this all in, as we kind of remind ourselves of where we've been, may we truly walk out this story in the way Jesus is asking us to do.